Back in the spring of 2018, I was living in a cramped Brooklyn apartment with my best friend in the entire world. We'd each moved to New York City around the same time, two country girls feeling way out of our depth in the big city, and struck up an instant connection once we'd heard each other's accents in a coffee shop. She'd grown up in Kentucky while I was literally just over the state line in West Virginia, and we'd each had a very similar rural upbringing. On top of that, we had a similar sense of humor, similar tastes, and we just clicked. Yet there was one major difference between us. Kayla had been sad to leave her little town behind. She'd been sad to leave her family, sad to leave her friends. The Big Apple was calling her all right, but she still pined for home. But for me, I didn't miss home one bit, and my family is about as messed up as they come. But it's not really their fault. I guess they're responsible for their actions and all, but we suffered a family tragedy when I was a kid, and it really took its toll. Either way, meeting her was an absolute blessing, but as much as we enjoyed each other's company, we started pining for some more masculine company, if you catch my drift. And since talking to strangers in NYC is the fastest way to end up bound and gagged in someone's basement, we decided to try dating apps on for size. Honestly, I found Tinder and Hinge to be a little overwhelming, but my roommate had much more luck with an app called Bumble. Basically, the premise is that the girls talk first, giving them much more control over their interactions with the guys they match with. So, it was little surprise that she landed a very promising-looking guy before I did. He was handsome, well-read, and he was also from the South, but he'd said he'd moved around an awful lot during his childhood, so he didn't consider himself from any one particular place. All in all, he sounded like a nice guy, and after a few dates, my roommate brought him back to our apartment on a night that I happened to be awake. I was excited to meet him, but even more excited for my roommate to start spending nights at his place too, since I got the whole apartment to myself. And in New York City, solitude is a luxury that very few get to enjoy. Anyway, so it's Friday night. I'm sitting on the couch watching Netflix and demolishing some Pepperidge Farm when I hear my roommate's key in the door. In she walks with her date in tow. We make some introductions and a casual but friendly conversation begins. Only the more we talk, the more I realize there's something oddly familiar about my roommate's Bumble date. And unfortunately, this is where my story needs to take a little tangent. See, my 10-year-old brother was murdered, and his killer was someone our whole family knew. I was just 6 years old when Mom and Dad took me over to stay with my grandpa. They told me it would just be one night, and 3 days later, they finally showed up again to tell me that Ryan wouldn't be coming home, and that he'd have gone to live in heaven with Grandma. I'd already suffered through the loss of my grandmother, but at that age, I think death was still a very abstract concept to me. I didn't grasp the permanence of it, or even what it really meant. It sucked that I couldn't see Gam Gam anymore, but at the same time, it just felt like she and Ryan were in the next room over. Not gone, just not visible. I was sad about it, don't get me wrong, but I don't think it really affected me until much later on, when I actually learned about the circumstances surrounding Ryan's death. I don't remember exactly when I learned about it, but I know it made me really angry and sad to think that the reason I couldn't see Ryan anymore was because someone had hurt him. It made it even worse that the person that had hurt him was supposed to be one of his friends. The little tidbit was like the salt in the wound. Like I knew the kid. I'd seen him and my brother hanging out on a number of different occasions. So when somebody mentioned that it was Troy Arnold that had killed Ryan, I became fixated on him, wondering how such a gangly mess of stick-thin limbs and scruffy dark hair could be capable of causing my family such pain. I remember his eyes, too, how they were so dark brown that they looked more inky black than anything else. And it was those eyes that featured heavily in the nightmares for a long time. But not until I actually found out how and why he'd killed my brother. According to Troy's confession, he and Ryan had been out playing by some train tracks one afternoon. Troy had found an old railroad fish plate, obviously tossed on the side of the tracks by some careless engineer. The thing must have weighed about 22 pounds, but all Troy said was that it felt really heavy in his hand. He and Ryan then walked down the train tracks a little ways until Ryan stopped to tie his laces. Troy said he just stared at the top of Ryan's head for a second and started to wonder what it would sound like if he hit him with the fish plate. So, he hit him, and Ryan started shaking something awful. Troy knew he'd be in trouble for what he'd done, so he decided to try and hide it. He bashed Ryan's head with the iron fish plate until he stopped moving. Now look, I've had time to think it over, and I do actually understand why I did the first part. Kids are dumb, cruel, and thoughtless, so it makes sense he'd take the coward's route in that respect. But what I don't understand is what he did next. When confronted by the cops, Troy said that all the other wounds on Ryan's body were the result of him being dragged to the shallow grave that he dug for him. Ryan was dragged for no more than 100 yards, but somehow, during the course of that short journey, his dead body sustained some of the following damage. It appeared an attempt had been made to cut Ryan's tongue out. Both of his eyes were missing from their sockets. Fingers were missing, as they'd been ripped off at the joint. More than one piece of debris had been inserted into Ryan's rectal cavity. There was catastrophic damage done to his private areas, as if they'd been repeatedly smashed in an attempt to pulverize them. And some of that info didn't trickle down to me in a clinical fashion. No. All I heard were rumors, some of which weren't all that far off from the truth. In the end, Troy Arnold was sent away to juvie in some other state, and since he was so young when he killed my brother, the federal government gave him a brand new identity at age 18, so he could go out into the world as quite literally a different person. The nightmares continued for years after, and the more I knew regarding Ryan's death, the more intense they got. It got to the point where I kept dreaming that Troy Arnold would come for me too. He'd gotten one sibling, now it was time to get the other. Since the only thing I really remembered about Troy was how black his eyes were and how scruffy his hair was, those became the central features of this monster my mind had created, until there came a time when the nightmares would simply be of some tuft of dark hair with glistening eyes staring out from it. Which brings me back to my chance meeting with my roommate's Bumble date. Because as good-looking as he was, something about the color of his eyes and the way he carried himself, it brought me back some seriously horrible memories. Not that I said anything, of course. Not at first, anyway. But the longer we talked, the more I started to piece together who exactly we were talking to. He was reluctant to talk about family, and any attempt to pin down something about his formative years was quite succinctly evaded. When he mentioned something traumatic happening during his youth, I almost snapped. But then I started to get this weird, crushing feeling in my gut, something I couldn't quite pin down until one horrible moment of realization. It happened the moment I mentioned growing up in West Virginia. The Bumble date guy shot me this look, this distinctly guilty look, and what had once been a friendly conversation turned into an impromptu staring competition. My roommate was like, "What's going on?" But her question was accompanied by an awkward giggle. She could obviously pick up the tension. She just didn't know why it was so thick in the air all of a sudden. "Troy?" I remember asking. The word just sort of left my mouth before I could think about the implications, like the whole thing was a completely involuntary act. Jesus Christ. The way he looked at me afterward with those black-brown irises that seemed to take up his entire eye. It was him. My brother's murderer was sitting right in front of me. My nightmares had come to visit. "I should go," he said, as he began to walk out, and the words just wouldn't come to me. I sat there dumbfounded while my roommate was all like, "Hey, whoa, what just happened here? Your name isn't Troy? Who's Troy? Where are you going? What just happened?" I managed to catch him right before he walked out the door, and all I could bring myself to say was like, "Don't come back." What followed was a complete reliving of something I tried so hard to get over. Obviously, I had to tell my roommate everything, and I mean everything, so she could actually understand A, what had just happened, and B, why I'd had such a strong reaction to it. The thing that got at me first was the sheer improbability of it. Of all the apartments in all the cities in all the world, it seemed like a cosmic joke directed right at me, one designed by a cruel universe to undo all the progress I'd made. But my roommate helped me rationalize it. I mean, New York City is the place to go if you want to be anonymous, right? Of all the places where a person could just blend into a crowd, NYC had to top the list. She was a real help, and support she showed during the fallout from the chance encounter, it only further solidified what an incredible friendship we had, and still have to this day. And if there's one takeaway from the whole online dating thing to be taken from this, is that you never know who you're talking to. They could give you some story about how they're the second coming of Christ, but it's all just a ruse, all just an attempt to scrub the blood from their hands. Blood that will always be there, no matter how much they try to be rid of it. Have you ever jumped from the roof of a 2-story building? It hurts, especially when you're unable to pull off a proper landing. I had to do this once in order to save my own life. Let me take you back to when I was 18 and 19 years old. I'm 26 now. My boyfriend at the time was extremely abusive, but being scared, naive, and believing that he loved me and would change, I stayed with him. We had several problems. We abused substances together, which was one of the reasons why I believed we really loved each other. Just the drugs were making us act a way we never had before towards each other. We had trust issues. We were desperately codependent. We're on and off constantly, and he had a problem with not being able to keep his hands to himself in his fits of rage. I was very depressed. My family and friends didn't want anything to do with me for obvious reasons, but he made it seem like I couldn't have friends anyway or even talk to anyone without his knowledge. He would check my phone when I slept. He would interrogate me. When I had a job, I worked in a place that had horrible phone reception. If I didn't return his text fast enough, or if the text didn't add up because of the reception and the fact that he wouldn't receive my text in order, he accused me of texting someone else I was cheating on him with and would threaten me. He would insult me, tell me he knew I would never leave him because I wouldn't be able to get anyone better than him. He called me stupid, ugly, all sorts of terrible names. I never even cheated on him. He would lie to me about sleeping with other women just to hurt me and see me cry. Then he would physically abuse me, slap, choke to the point that I thought he was going to knock me out or worse. The worst one of all, however, was this one time we were hanging out at a park, partaking in things we probably shouldn't have in public. I won't go into too much detail because I'm afraid of him seeing this, and I've been scared for years that he would find me. I literally have nightmares about him finding out where I live and showing up at my house. I wake up drenched in sweat, and I'm actually sweating typing this right now. So we're at the park, and for some reason to this day I still can't fathom why, he starts hurting himself right in front of me. I freak out and tell him I'm going to call an ambulance for his own safety, and he just takes off running. About 10 minutes later, a police car and paramedic shows up, and he's nowhere to be found. I told them the general direction he ran in and apologized for wasting their time. Maybe about 20 minutes later, he calls me. I answer, and he's just screaming at me. "Why would you call the cops on me?" I apologized profusely, trying to explain through my tears that I was deeply concerned for his safety and that I hadn't actually called the police, that I had called an ambulance and didn't know the police would also show up. I'm crying, begging him to tell me where he is. He says he's on the roof of a building and gives me cross streets to his location. I stupidly meet up with him. I climb up the building onto the roof. The sun has gone down and it's dark at this point. We just start talking and he's acting like everything is normal. I can't remember what we're actually talking about, but I remember thinking how nice it was to actually just have a conversation with him without yelling insults or accusations. Then, all of a sudden, he pounces on me. I'm on my back and his knees are digging into my shoulders, holding my arms down. His eyes look crazy and soulless. Then he starts slapping me in the face. I later find out that one particular slap was so hard he gave me a black eye. He's screaming at me. I can't remember what all he said, but I know he was calling me names, accusing me of things I never did. Then he starts punching my legs, and telling me that he's gonna have his way with me. My back is hurting from the stucco roof and it's bleeding through my shirt. I think he choked me too, but I can't remember. I seriously thought that I was about to die. Then I had finally went into survival mode. I'm sobbing and pleading with him. If you really love me, why are you doing this? I never even did anything to you. If you truly love me, you'll just stop. Please. As soon as I say this, it's like flipping a switch. His eyes and demeanor change, and he gets off of me. He starts apologizing, and as soon as he turns his back, I jump off the roof. I landed horribly, and I hear him from the rooftop yelling. At this time, I'm thinking I broke my back and feet, and I'm lying in a crumpled heap in an alleyway. I hear him coming down, and I'm thinking how I need to get to the street and scream for help. He's getting closer, trying to help me up, and while dragging myself army style to the road, I scream as loud as I can for him to not touch me. You just tried to kill me. I see a man on the sidewalk across the street. I yell to him to please help and call the police. I'm guessing he did. I think I kind of blacked out at this point, but I remember seeing my ex run off with my purse in his hands. I went to the hospital and the police caught him a couple of hours later, and from what I heard, he put up a pretty good fight with them. It's been so long now that this story feels like a bad dream. I can't believe this actually happened, but I am grateful I survived. Needless to say, I've been clean for several years. I have my family, friends, and life back. I am married now to a wonderful man who would never even think of hurting me. We have a couple of children, and I love my life. To anyone out there in an abusive relationship, please, get out while you can. Nothing is worth risking your life every day with a lunatic, and there is someone out there who will love you and not take you for granted. You're worth so much more. Target was my favorite place to go shopping. I'm sad to say I don't think I can never go back there though. Sometimes when you have such a bad experience, it will ruin the love you had for a place or a store altogether, and that's what happened to me. It all started when I graduated college. I was a psychology major and I struggled to find a job. I live in a mid-sized city and there just wasn't anything appealing to me. There weren't any jobs in my field that I could get. The only psychology job I could even find wanted 10 years of experience. So I had to take whatever job I could get. I ended up working at some funky call center, and I say funky because it really was a complete dumpster fire every single day. The managers had no idea what was going on. My coworkers were some of the weirdest people I'd ever seen. Most of them didn't have a college education either, which made me feel really bad about myself. I had some really low confidence during this time, and I felt like a failure. I still lived with my parents and had a massive amount of student debt, and I was working at a call center making minimum wage. I had also let myself go during the last few months of my senior year in college. I was really stressed out trying to pass. I just didn't have time to make salad or go for runs anymore. I was feeling really down there for a bit, and this is where James comes in. He was a really weird guy that worked at the call center too. He had a goofy-looking mustache and was a bit of a creep. I definitely saw him checking me out a few times, and I even saw him look at other girls too. A little pervy, but I couldn't expect anything less from a place like this that I worked at. Oddly enough, James was the only guy at this place that was ever nice to me. Everyone else was so miserable to be there. James had been hired a couple of weeks before I got the job there, so I guess it just didn't have enough time to make me and James completely miserable yet. There was one time when I went out for a smoke break. James joined me and started flirting with me. He definitely had his problems, but there was something about getting a little bit of attention that did kind of make me feel special. I was always a very introverted person, and I hadn't had a boyfriend in over 2 years. It felt nice to be noticed. It wasn't long before we exchanged numbers and started talking a little bit outside of work. There were a few weeks there that I kept trying to get him to shave his mustache. I told him he would look a lot better. It took about 3 weeks to finally get through to him, but when he did, I was surprised. He was actually a really handsome guy under that caterpillar, and that was when I made up my mind. If he made a move on me, I wasn't going to say no. He never made a move on me though, and I was surprised because I was sending some pretty strong signals for him to do so. He just never did. Not even over text messages or anything. All he would ever do was flirt. It wasn't very long into that situation that I gave up on him. I figured he didn't like me. I mean, honestly, what else was I supposed to think? I downloaded Tinder like everyone else. I knew my situation was bad, and I secretly fantasized about hooking up with some rich guy. I didn't find a buff millionaire, but I did find a really nice guy eventually. We went on a few dates and started going out together regularly, and I really liked him. We're still together, by the way. But this is where things got weird with James. He started acting differently. He started doing more and more inappropriate things. I was friends with James on Facebook, and when I changed my status to an in a relationship, he did one of those emoji reactions, and he put an angry face. I remember seeing it and rolling my eyes. Typical men, I thought. They don't want you until you have someone else. Now, something James would always do with me is send slightly naked pictures. It wasn't like full frontal or anything like that, but he would take racy photos of himself getting out of the shower or changing and things like that. That was okay when I was single, but he just didn't stop. And these new pics were much more revealing, if you know what I mean. And I kept telling him that I was in a relationship and he couldn't do this anymore. He just wouldn't listen. He always said that he forgot, and I knew he was doing it intentionally. Things also got really awkward at work. There were quite a few things that he would do that were just freaky. For example, pens started disappearing from my desk. I didn't think anything of it at first, just that I was being clumsy. But one day I happened to walk by James's desk and notice all of my pens. He also followed me outside every time I went on a smoke break. He always played it off like he wasn't doing anything, but it was so obvious to everyone. Well, it was around the 6-month mark of me working at that funky call center. I had my performance review and I got a raise. I got an extra $1 an hour, which I was pretty happy about. I had a few $100 in savings and decided to treat myself to my favorite store, Target. I remember making a self-congratulatory post on Facebook about it. I even mentioned that I was going to treat myself to some new sheets from Target. I remember getting comments from some of my friends and former classmates. They all congratulated me and I was really excited. Sure, I had a stupid job, but I was making the best of my situation. I remember getting to Target at about 6 or 7 on a Friday night. I went alone. I walked into the store and went over to the bedding aisle. I really wanted to pick out the best sheets for me. I am a little OCD about fabric and how things feel, so I was running my hands across the sheets to find the one that I liked the best. That was when something unexpected happened. I felt a kiss on my neck. I had been so wrapped up in feeling sheets that I didn't even notice who was behind me. I immediately thought it was my boyfriend. I mean, who else would randomly kiss me in public, right? Well, you guessed it. It was James. I turned around after he kissed me, and I was smiling. But my giddiness turned to disgust when I saw that it was him. My stomach dropped, and I wanted to scream, but I just couldn't bring myself to do anything. More of me was in shock than anything else. I know I must have looked so repulsed, but that didn't stop him from pinning me up against the aisle rack and continuing to kiss me. He shoved his entire tongue down my throat. It was honestly disgusting. This probably went on for about 3 or 4 seconds before I finally snapped out of it. I pulled my head away and slapped him across the face as hard as I could. I told him that I never wanted to see him again. I fell down onto my back and I just sat there telling him to please leave me alone. He stood there, though, looking down at me, smiling. James was a really freaky guy. He started getting on top of me and kissing me again, and that was when I finally screamed at the top of my lungs. Someone who must have been in an aisle over or two overheard and came running. It was a man who looked like he was in his 30s. He ripped James off of me and threw him against the wall. After that, James took off. The man was really nice to me. He helped me up and made sure I was okay. He asked if I wanted to call the police, and I was so shocked I just told him no in the moment. And that wouldn't be the last time that I saw James. We still work at the same call center, and my God, it's pretty awkward. I know he still creeps on my Facebook, and he looks at me all the time. I'm honestly not sure what to do about it. I haven't even told my boyfriend what happened, and honestly, I'm kind of afraid to. But I seriously might have to, one of these days.